Excellent. Looks like we're all here. So I'd like to take a moment to welcome everyone to the 2021 National Postdoctoral Association Gender Equity Summit. I'm Caleb McKinney, and I serve on the board of directors and as treasurer of the NPA, and I'm Assistant Dean of Graduate and Postdoctoral Training and Development at Georgetown University Biomedical Graduate Education, and I'll serve as your moderator for our opening session this morning. So the NPA is the national voice of the postdoctoral community, and recently we released our new strategic plan that highlights diversity, equity, and inclusion as one of its four core strategic pillars. And we launched this summit in light of this new plan to advance, both to advance the conversation around gender-based inequities affecting the postdoc community, and to really start to drive positive, actionable actions to improve the postdoc environment. So I'd like to welcome you to our first session, Framing the Issues, Gender Equity Summit Kickoff. And so some quick housekeeping before I introduce our speakers. As a reminder, as attendees, you're in listen-only mode. Your cameras and mics are off, however you can, and I really encourage you to use the chat function on the right side of the screen. The chat function is intended for general discussion around the topics that you'll hear today. You can also ask questions of the presenters by using the Q&A function by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And I'll actually be collating questions as the presenters are speaking, and I'll pose these questions to the presenters in the form of a roundtable discussion with the presenters after everybody's had a chance to present their content. And so we'll save questions for the end of the session in a roundtable discussion. So as you think of questions, go ahead and put them in the Q&A, and I'll start to collate those. And then lastly, please be reminded that this session is being recorded. So it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers for this session. We'll begin with Stephanie Eberle, who is the chair of the board of directors for the National Postdoctoral Association and executive director for BioSci careers at Stanford University. Stephanie will introduce our Gender Equity Summit and give us some remarks to help frame our discussion for today. And then next we'll have Julia Judish, Special Counsel for Pillsbury Winthrop Shaw Pittman, who will provide us with a very important legal backdrop of gender equity to help frame our conversation from the legal perspective. And then third, we'll welcome Dr. Lisa Begg to discuss the core issues and obstacles facing female early career researchers and some of the programs and resources that exist in the biomedical space, particularly through NIH and the Office of Research on Women's Health. So we'll take a programmatic look at the issues as well. And I'd like to remind our speakers to limit your remarks to 15 minutes each. And so now you've heard enough from me. It's my pleasure to welcome Stephanie Eberle to the mic to start us off. Stephanie.
Gender Equity Summit. To begin talking about gender equity, we have to understand what we mean by both gender and equity. I frame the issues around decentering masculinity. To understand gender, we first must understand that gender is a social construct and it's a hierarchical one, meaning that it benefits all of us in some way. It was built around one focus, i.e. masculine. And the other thing to understand about it is dichotomous. The way we treat it in our society is dichotomous, as though there were only two genders. And to really be able to deconstruct this and to really be able to decenter masculinity, we need to understand these as hierarchical and dichotomous. Gender as hierarchy is understanding a value versus what is valued in our society. There's a significant amount of research that around that looks at the value of diversity within the workforce and gender diversity specifically. For instance, the idea of new perspectives and collaboration, the idea that the more perspectives we have, the better the ideas and the implementation, and the more collaboration around the implementation. Interestingly, as we'll talk about in a few minutes in some later slides, one thing about collaboration is you notice that many times when you have been othered and you have had to compromise, that is you end up with a collaborative perspective by nature of just having to to compromise throughout your entire life. There's representation of the population, so understanding the majority of the world is about half female, half male. If we use a binary position, it is much more broad if we use a non-binary position. And but the fact is that in your business, in your work, in your organization, the more representation you have, the more representative of the population, the more appealing your product or service. Recruitment and retention. So what we find in the workplace is that the more representation we have, the more diversity we have, the easier it is to recruit and retain our most diverse populations, right? So what we do is we look for people who we think are going to welcome us and treat us fairly, and so those are some of the best, that's kind of some of the best, methods for recruitment. And then finally, profitability. McKinsey and Company is, of course, a major consulting firm, finds that the firms that are the most diverse are also those that are the most profitable. So it does behoove us to add gender equity to the work that we do. That being said, much of the work that we do, the way we do show value is through value signaling and through lip service. So when we talk about value signaling, we saw this quite a lot over the last year, where many of the companies and organizations that put out statements on value of diversity actually did not, now 1 year later, have not really been able to come to the table and show what they have done. That means what people are doing is they're putting words out and saying that they support this, and then it stops there. The other thing that happens, and I have experienced this myself, is going about this diversity recruitment piece a little bit awkwardly. For example, I have been in more interviews than I care to remember, wherein the gender that I appear or that I present with has been brought up in the interview, which I'm sure Julia will also address. But I have been told in a major campus interview, I was told, well, one concern we have about you is that you are a woman, and this was disconcerting for two reasons. Number one, that they would be blatantly telling me that this is a problem. Number two is I am out about being non-binary. I do not identify as female. I present female, but I do not identify solely as female. So this was two cuts in one. And I happen to be in a position of privilege wherein I am able to turn a job down because of this. Many people are not, especially our early career researchers, are not able to do this. The other thing I will say about diversity recruitment, I was at a conference recently and we were talking about diversity. It was a session on diversity. And one of the presenters made a comment, and this was not about gender, it was about race, but I do believe this happens similarly with gender, where the woman made a comment. She said, I would like to hire some Black people. Please let me know if you know any. And I thought, well, this is probably the last place I'm going to send anybody then with any diverse identity, because this is clearly about a lip service, and I really feel very nervous about sending somebody to a place where where there might be a value of diversity, but probably not one of equity and inclusion, and those and belonging. And so those are three components of this equation that we really need to consider not just how do we get people in, but also how do we treat them when they are there. We do find then that because of gender being a particular hierarchy, we do find then that one particular, certain populations are devalued, and as you see here from the work that we've done on wage gap, this most impacts women, but also especially women of color, and the representation piece is a significant piece. So there is a difference between negotiating with somebody who understands you, has a similar identity, versus somebody who does not. There is also that also leads to a devaluing. If I do not encounter people who are different than me, I'm less likely to value them. I found this an interesting experience. I had an interesting experience once here. I'm in Silicon Valley, and I was at a major venture capital firm, and I asked something very simple, which was where the ladies' room was, and he said, "I don't know if we have one." And it turns out they do. And again, Julia, maybe you can speak to this, but I think they might legally have to have one. I don't know, but they didn't actually know if they had a women's restroom. So, when you don't even know if there's a restroom for one segment of the population, then I do wonder how well we are considering them when it comes time to making major decisions like who should be on our board, how much should we pay them. There's a difference in how and where women-identified humans work, and I want to point out when I was making these slides, humans came up in my spelling and grammar check as incorrect. I think what it wants me to say is where women work, and because again I'm not all that fond of the binary, I found this kind of interesting because of course even our spell check and our grammar check is binary. But there is a significant, the reason I'm specific about this though, is that we find that even those who appear as cis male do also, who also maybe are, maybe appear a little more on the feminine spectrum, or those who are trans female, or who are in work that is perhaps has been traditionally identified as women's work. We find that they also experience this gap in wage in particular, right? So it is the feminized version of the human that is devalued, and that is on the lower side of a hierarchy. And then if you happen to be a person of color who is maybe on the feminine side, that is equally lower, right, or lesser than as we go, not equally but lesser than. So where are women identified humans? They are in caregiving roles that tend to pay less. And we also are finding that almost because they are feminized roles, that is one reason they are paid less. So, and then women identified humans are also more likely to be working part-time for various reasons. One of those reasons is the lion's share of the work, that those who are woman identified are also more likely to be doing more of the work at home. So the cleaning, the cooking, and this is still true today in 2021. Though I would like to believe that is gotten a little more progressive, though it is still true, especially during the pandemic. We have seen this, that a lot of those who left the workplace were women identified, and this is largely because of childcare concerns. I think it's important as we talk about what is valued and what is devalued. I think in this hierarchy, I think it's important to point out that children are actually not a women's issue. Children are a women's health issue, as in they give birth. But men, male identified people also have children. And so we need to be very careful about the way we converse and talk about this topic, because when we talk about it as a women's issue, that signals to those at the higher end of the hierarchy that they do not have to, that they are not involved, i.e., they should not be involved, right, in this process, and that by nature just ends up devaluing the process of childcare, and then ends up keeping it at the lower end of the hierarchy. It is a much better idea or a much better practice to start thinking about this as a human issue. Childcare is a human issue, and the problems that we have, wherein it is put on another more largely on one end of the population, that is a gender equity issue, right? That's not necessarily a women's issue. That is a gender equity issue because it is in fact inequitable. The negotiation double standard, a lot of people push back on the gender gap and say, well, that's because women do not negotiate. Those who are female identified do not negotiate. The problem, though, is that when those who are female identified do negotiate, there's a double standard, i.e., asking for more money can be seen as being uppity. If you ask on behalf of your children or your family, I need more money because of this, it is seen as you are going to be, maybe you're going to be leaving the office too much, maybe you'll be focused elsewhere, or it is seen as maybe even weak. So there is, while it is true that those who are female identified often do not negotiate, it is also true that when they do, it doesn't go as well as it does for those who are white, hetero, able-bodied cis males. Then, of course, we cannot forget bias, and this is bias, I think, encompasses all of these aspects. This idea that, again, that those who are women identified are going to just take time off to be mothers. They are going to gossip at the water cooler. They're going to be weaker. That the work that they do is maybe less than. I experienced in another job interview at one point, coming out at, I'm pretty openly lesbian and non-binary, and I had somebody in an interview once mention, actually, it's a bonus to hire a lesbian because it means you will not have children. I don't know. If this were a regular, in-person audience, we'd have this uncomfortable chuckle at this point, because obviously I could technically have children if I wanted to, and I've chosen not to, and that is simply just by choice. But there is this assumption, and it is bold to be making these assumptions so blatantly, especially considering legal concerns and this need and this knowledge that we have that actually gender diversity is valuable. So let's talk a little bit about the binary eyes dichotomy. So I wanted to talk about these two terms. Binary within gender literature is a common term for an identity. So we're on the binary. Where are you on the binary spectrum? I have found that the society treats treats gender as dichotomy. So you're either male or female, and in the hierarchy, the masculine is centered. I have this, one example that I think many of us can relate to in some way if you follow. I was giving a keynote speech a couple of years ago, and I needed to have a professional photo. So I had many taken, and this is the first one that came up. I put all three of my photos up on Facebook, and I asked friends and acquaintances to tell me which they preferred, and this is what the majority preferred. And in fact, this is what my photographer preferred. And I have to say, I hate this photo. One of the reasons I hate it is, first of all, the experience was horrible of sitting there and trying to have somebody take your picture, and the entire time telling me your eyes are too small, open up, smile bigger, can you tilt your head to a side? And what friends said, and acquaintances rather said, on Facebook about this photo was it looks more feminine, it's more friendly, it's more open, it's more happy. And I had a few people say it's more you. But anybody who knows me knows that this is actually more me, because this is, it was a very serious presentation. It was more, I am a pretty serious person. I did want to convey a certain amount of confidence, but this is considered unfriendly. I ended up making a compromise, and that is to say, let me say, that is to say that the authentic self then was, I was seen as the most inauthentic. And then so I compromised and I said, all right, so we'll add a little bit of a smirk here, but not the whole big open my eyes wide kind of what I considered more of a clown face that he kept trying to get me to do. And for those of you who are othered in society, I wonder if we can also relate to this. I mean, this experience, this is what society wants. This is who I am. And so we compromise. So when I was saying earlier that a lot of those who identify, who are women identified, you have to make these choices, and it's no wonder we're seen as collaborative. This is why, because we're constantly making these compromises. And it's kind of, it's interesting because because when you look at what men want, 48% of men would also like to stay at home. 79% of men of suicides are male. It is not as though women identified people are the only ones who have these concerns, who care about children, who need to adapt. The bait and switch interviewing is another way this is done, where it is posted that we care deeply about gender equity. When we get there, we find out that what is happening is we are just there for the gender diversity piece, and not necessarily for what we bring. Definitions of success are based largely on masculine views, or traditionally masculine views, social views of success, and our gender. And the more masculine you are, the more rewarded you are. And then, of course, there's the comfort, the idea that I do not want to use your correct pronoun because it's more comfortable for me not to do so, and this forcing you into the social norm. So when we decide how do we decenter masculinity, it means that all genders are seen and heard and valued. And that is understanding too the intersection of identity. So all people of color, all women and men of color, all of those on the spectrum are represented and valued. The National Postdoctoral Association addresses these through advocating for our constituents. These are two of the main pillars that we have added recently that Caleb mentioned: advocating for our constituents and championing a greater diversity, equity, and inclusion model. And we do this through honest brokering, through no judgment, and trying to provide resources. And we do that in many ways through our 8 committees of leadership, our awareness efforts, our NPA communications, our National Postdoctoral Association Week, communications through our postdoc resources that we provide. We do have a current call for board leaders, and then our Impact Fellows program aims to not just diversify the organization, but then to also bring in that piece of belonging. Because again, it is quite imperative if we're going to decenter masculinities, and it is imperative that we build in belonging into the system, not just representation. So thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing the rest of our panel.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephanie, for that introduction. That was really key to framing the discussion for not only the rest of this session, but also I think it was a great way to frame the entire summit's sessions for the next couple of days. And so just a quick reminder to everyone, we'll address questions once the final presentation in the session has concluded. And in the meantime, definitely feel free to go to the Q&A and write down any questions that you have, and any thoughts that you have, put them in the chat. Keep the conversation going in the chat as the presenters are talking, and we're happy to kind of field that as we have our roundtable at the end. And so now we'll pull up, we've got Julia's slides there. Perfect. All right. Welcome, Julia, to the mic. Take it away.
Thank you, Caleb, and thank you, Stephanie, for that introduction. So I'm here to take you on a whirlwind tour of what the law can and can't do. Next slide, please. And how the law is an important backstop, but it is not the solution to achieving gender equity. Next slide. So as an overview, in the gender equity area, as relevant to postdocs, there are a number of statutes and legal principles that can be used to address unlawful conduct. The one that is sort of the grandparent in the room is Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972. This applies in the context of education programs that receive federal financial assistance, and it provides that no person in the U.S. shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination in such programs. The term sex discrimination includes discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. In addition to prohibiting discrimination and harassment, it also protects against retaliation, requires educational institutions to have Title IX offices to investigate complaints. So students and postdocs and others at the institution can use the institution's grievance process or can file a complaint with the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights. There's time limits on this. You have to file within 180 days of the date of the alleged wrongdoing, or if you file the institutional grievance within 60 days after the last act of the institutional grievance process. Then if you move outside of the educational context, Title VII protects against discrimination, harassment, and retaliation in employment at non-educational institutions, or institutions that don't receive federal financial funding. Under Title VII, you can't go straight to court. You have to first file a complaint with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. There's also the Equal Pay Act that requires that employees of opposite genders, is a dichotomy under the statute, as stated, receive equal pay for equal work on jobs, the performance of which requires equal skill, effort, and responsibility, and which are performed under similar working conditions. This is actually a very narrow statute, and it has a giant loophole. A differential based on any other factor other than sex is lawful. For this reason, and also on the positive side, because such facially obvious compensation discrimination is no longer common, the Equal Pay Act is rarely used these days. There's also common law torts. Torts are wrongs for which a civil action can be brought regardless of whether criminal conduct occurred. Claims like assault, intentional negligent infliction of emotional distress, negligent supervision, these are claims that can be brought in a court of law. And depending on what promises are made to an individual postdoc type of situation, there might be breach of contract claims. Next slide, please. So I thought it would be helpful to just spend a minute or two on a case study of how these play out. In 2018, there was a class action lawsuit against Dartmouth's Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences that alleged sexual misconduct, largely towards graduate students, and that the administration turned a blind eye despite multiple formal and informal Title IX complaints. All three of the accused professors, an older endowed chair and two younger tenured brain science professors, left Dartmouth following investigations and recommendations of dismissal. They either resigned or retired before they were dismissed. The allegations related to perpetuation of an alcohol-saturated party culture, lab meetings held at bars, students invited to hot tub parties at the homes of the professors, unwelcome sexual contact one of the named plaintiffs alleged that there had actually been rape. Although there were only 3 named plaintiffs in the class action, another 65 women participated in the class action who worked with the professors or said they were affected by the professors' misconduct. The claims brought in the class included not only the Title IX claims against the university, but also common law claims, torts, breach of fiduciary duty, and negligent supervision and retention. The complaint alleged that the female students who participated in the partying and accepted the sexual comments and overtures were rewarded with academic attention, while those who refrained were ignored and neglected academically. Graduate students feared retaliation if they refrained. In July 2020, Dartmouth settled the class action for $14 million, of which $5 million went to pay plaintiffs' attorneys' fees. We don't know what Dartmouth's own legal fees were, but it's clear from this example that simply in terms of the monetary cost to educational institutions, setting aside the human cost to those involved, these kinds of claims can be extremely costly. Next slide, please. That example primarily dealt with graduate students, but the postdocs are especially vulnerable to gender-based misconduct. They don't have tenure. They're in temporary positions. They may be dependent on others' grants, including the perpetrators of the discrimination or harassment. Postdocs typically have a smaller peer group. They're not part of the regular faculty or the graduate student community. Many may have recently relocated for their postdoc. There's concern that complaining about their mentors may jeopardize career prospects, especially because postdocs are still early stage, establishing their professional reputations and CVs. Postdocs are also often juggling multiple stressors given the juxtaposition of their career stage and their life stage. Could still have student debt or other financial burdens. Pregnancy, childcare pressures are particularly pronounced often at that point in life, but also as well often without financial or community safety net or supports, because it's not all that common that your postdoc happens to correspond with where your family and friends are located. When institutions do take action, postdocs are sometimes excluded from the protections that the institutions have in mind. They're not considered. I've included on the slide a link to another case study. It's a March 2021 article in Chemical and Engineering News about a University of Minnesota case. In brief, the university investigated multiple sexual harassment complaints against a prominent biochemist, professor, and researcher. The investigation concluded that he engaged in egregious and repetitive conduct that created an intimidating, hostile, and offensive working environment and was patently offensive, unacceptable, and directly inconsistent with principles of academic integrity and responsibility. He was not fired, but he was sanctioned. He was prohibited from supervising undergraduates for 3 years and suspended from the graduate program for 3 years. But he was permitted to keep his lab running with postdocs. And the sanctions and the reason for them were largely kept confidential. So postdocs working in his lab were unaware of the issues and the limitations. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned at the start, the legal regime here is not designed as a solution to promote gender equity. It's designed to prevent and correct unlawful conduct. Another challenge to achieving gender equity is tenure, which reduces turnover and preserves past disparities. I've included a graph that shows that of all tenured positions in the US in 2018, over 60% were held by men. The gender disparity in tenured positions in STEM fields is even larger. According to 2017 data, women in the United States made up only 29% of those employed in STEM occupations. That's both inside academia and outside academia. And I don't have the figures for tenured jobs. In addition, progress by law cannot discriminate against individual men based on their gender. Hiring and promotion quotas, with rare exceptions, are unlawful, even to advance diversity goals. So there have to be indirect methods of getting there. And there are strategies that institutions can use, such as expanding recruiting pools, to make sure you're considering a diverse pool. But you can't just say, okay, we need more women-identified professors in this position, and we must hire on that basis. Also, intentional discrimination is hardly the sole cause of gender discrimination. Studies show that implicit bias against hiring women in traditionally male-dominated fields exists. Implicit bias also affects racial minorities. I've included in the resource materials more information about implicit bias and how it works and resources for addressing it. And as I mentioned, often postdoctoral opportunities overlap with when postdocs are starting families, pregnancy, breastfeeding, childcare responsibilities, which still disproportionately fall on female postdocs. Next slide, please. I wanted to spend a little bit longer on Title IX because it's so prominent in postdoc settings, and explain some of the knotty problems and why, even as a backstop, it sometimes is not wholly satisfying to any of the parties. So if you have a postdoc facing sexual harassment or discrimination who's brave enough to bring a Title IX complaint forward, the process is challenging. In our legal system, an accused has due process rights, so anonymity isn't an option. This is good from a due process standpoint, but it often deters complaints because of fear of being labeled a troublemaker or fear of retaliation. Some accused go on the offensive, and if they dispute the allegations against them, may bring defamation claims against their accuser or the institution, or may challenge the institution's contractual right to impose sanctions or to fire them. Even if the conduct has been witnessed by others, which it often is not, those witnesses may be reluctant to take a side. They may fear the impact on their own career prospects. In the cases of extreme misconduct, dismissal is the obvious sanction, but institutions also wrestle with identifying appropriate lesser sanctions for offenses that are viewed as less egregious. Many institutions prefer confidentiality in terms of resolutions, as do the accused and as do some victims, frankly. But that means that others aren't forewarned or even aware of the sanctions or that there's been past misconduct. And the reality is that institutions weigh grant money, prestige, and the substantive work done by the accused. Most research academics aren't fungible. It may be comparatively easy to hire someone else to teach an accused course load and take it over from them, but not to take over the accused grants or research projects. So institutions may be reluctant to take corrective action that means ejecting someone who has been found to have engaged in misconduct. All of these considerations often lead to inaction by institutions. Where gender harassment and discrimination are permitted to persist, women protect themselves, and it's men too as well, but those who are the targets of this behavior protect themselves from harmful environments by avoiding or leaving the research lab, the institution, academia, or even the profession entirely. The ripple effect from gender harassment can reach much further than the direct victims. Professors then become afraid of potential accusations, and there is, in my experience, a sort of outsized fear of false accusations that can lead to a backlash of avoiding mentoring or being alone with female postdocs or postdocs that the professor is afraid may accuse them of sexual advances. Like former Vice President Pence's rule that he would not have lunch alone with a woman other than his wife, this results in skewing informal opportunities for mentorship. As also shows how institutions deal with Title IX complaints is a decision really on allocation and of the burden and costs to careers of misconduct. Should the focus be on how sanctions affect the accuser's career, or should it be on the impact of retaining someone who is engaged in misconduct on opportunities for, largely in this case, women in the field? Next slide, please. Also complicating this issue is that social science shows that issues of gender harassment are affected by different understandings of the same behavior. This slide shows the results of a 2017 study on differences in whether men and women consider certain behaviors to be harassing. And how behavior is interpreted is also affected by whether there's a power imbalance at play. For example, there's a male worker at a deli I used to frequent who would often hand me my order with a, "Here you go, honey." That did not offend or threaten me. But if the male managing partner at my firm handed me a file with, "Here you go, honey," I would feel belittled and embarrassed. The same words, but a different context. And for postdocs, the dynamics of a power imbalance, both in terms of your own mentors and students who may be working under your supervision, are issues that affect interpretation of conduct. Next slide, please. So lest I be a total downer in my presentation, there is a lot that can be done with the law as a backstop, but also beyond the minimum that the law requires. Because there are substantial challenges doesn't mean that gender equity progress can't be made, just that legal remedies aren't the primary answer. Institutions can adopt policies and pursue best practices to promote gender equity. This slide lists some of them. So ensuring more than token diversity in panels, speakers, and opportunities. To go back to Stephanie's presentation when she mentioned the person who said, "I don't know, do you know anyone Black?" I don't. There are diverse subject matter experts who need to be recognized and brought in. Training professors and researchers about EEO policies, implicit bias, mentoring, and observing and setting professional boundaries. Creating a culture, a top-down culture and tone of equity, transparency, and support. And tracking retention and equity progress. If we don't measure it, how will we know that we're achieving it? You're measuring it not for quotas, but to be aware of areas in which you need to make progress. And adopting policies that promote shared family and childcare responsibilities so that the burden of them is less disproportionately carried. Designating men, destigmatizing men taking leave or delaying career milestone achievements so that family or parent care responsibilities aren't viewed as only female or feminine obligations, and encouraging flexibility and accommodating schedules and expectations wherever that's possible and consistent with the work that needs to be done. We'll take questions at the end of the panel, and now I'll turn it over to Lisa.
Thank you very much, Julia, and the other panel members. I'm Lisa Begg from the NIH, and my talk will actually have some common themes with the earlier panel members. And next slide, please. And thank you. So these slides will be available on the website, and I encourage you, because this is a big figure here, to review it after the meeting. But I'm leaving it up for now to give you a little background. So most of you, I'm sure, know National Institutes of Health, NIH, is the lead biomedical research agency across the government, supporting about $42 billion worth of research. My slides have disappeared, not sure why. We can get them back. Thank you. So is the largest supporter of biomedical research. We're also part of the Department of Health and Human Services, which comes in. Julia was giving you the legal framework. Our legal framework comes from the HHS Civil Rights Office, and some responsibilities have been transferred to NIH, and I get into that a little bit later. But this model here gives you sort of the overall concept, at least that NIH is working with, and it was created through a series of millions of dollars of research over the last 14, 15 years in terms of looking at barriers and opportunities to advance women in biomedical careers. And I should add that NIH as a federal agency does not target career development and training opportunities specifically for women. Men also benefit, minorities also benefit, underrepresented minorities, and so forth. We really intend as a federal agency to help the full pool of interested parties to gain research expertise and contribute to research and compete for funding through the NIH. So this particular slide here gives you some idea of the individual up to the larger issue. You'll see here that mentoring is mentioned in most of these circles. Mentoring is crucial. It's been mentioned before. Our research has found it to be particularly important for women, but also men in terms of STEM careers. And we use STEM as STEMM, the second M being medicine. And I wanted to draw your attention to the lead article that I cite several times. Dr. Phyllis Carr is cited here. She was one of the lead researchers that we funded back in 2009 and others as well. So this is sort of a summary report that will give you some idea of the issues, the barriers that we're dealing with. Next slide, please. Thank you. So also part of the Carr article, you can see here that we're looking at barriers. We're looking at compensation equity. That's been discussed. Career flexibility, mentoring, institutional programs to address this. And so part of the research dealing from earlier research going back to 2007, the National Academy of Sciences landmark report on beyond bias and barriers was basically the basis for this more recent activity. Next slide, please. Why are we addressing this? You've seen earlier slides that are similar. Just want to reinforce, if you're looking at this, what is the problem we're trying to solve? As you look at the bachelor level and go down to the dean and president level, the first couple stages look pretty comparable. In fact, women are a little bit higher in some of these areas. But as you go down to the leadership areas, you see quite a bit of differences. And this is based on 2015 data reported in 2019. So the problem is still present, and we are still all trying to address it. Next slide, please. So I alluded to this. Dr. Phyllis Carr and others were part of the successful grantees from what we call an RFA back in 2009, asking for applications to focus on research on causal factors and interventions that promote and support women in biomedical careers. There's two slides here. As you can see, and again, the overall article and the summary report go into this in more depth. They looked at, and we're looking at, educational pathways. What are the barriers and how can we address them? There's several issues there. Institutional factors, same thing, and that's been addressed and mentioned in different ways by the previous panel members. Want to bring your attention to the URL for the full article and encourage you to look at that. Next slide is part 2, which gets into the individual factors, career trajectories, and then intervention strategies. And we're at the point now where NIH is saying, we've done all this research. It may not answer all the questions, but we're really ready for interventions. And so you will see, I'm going to cite one of the most recent, it's called the program announcement that came out about a month ago, that's looking only at interventions. So NIH feels at this point in time, in terms of policy and previous research, this is where the focus needs to be, is on intervention research. And there's more details on our website, the Office of Research on Women's Health, which I do want to mention is part of the Office of the NIH Director. We work across NIH. We actually work across HHS. We partner with research institutions, advocacy groups, the public, and so we really are sort of the hub in terms of women's health research, although the vast majority of funding are done by our institute and center partners. If I could have the next slide, please. In terms of resources, I did want to focus on this. And this slide is maybe a little bit more difficult to read, but again, the URL is there. So if you're looking at extramural research, the vast majority of our $42 billion that goes out each year goes to universities and research institutions around the country and actually internationally as well. But in terms of research training, we tend to have the funding remain in the United States, although you'll see there's one slide that deals with international career development as well. So just to bring your attention, there are stages, as we all know, to career development. This gives you an option of kiosks to tailor your request, and this is particularly important to the postdocs that are in the audience here. You can a Ph.D. if you're an M.D., if you're interested in certain fields, or if you meet certain criteria in terms of eligibility. So again, I encourage you to go through these websites. And I do want to mention that NIH, we have a tremendous amount of information on our websites. And for the most part, I'm virtually sure that all of the links have an email address if you have questions. And I encourage folks who are interested to query myself and NIH colleagues in terms of questions and clarifications needed. Next slide, please. This is the intramural program, and I want to sort of define this. Intramural in this sense are federal employees who work at the NIH in laboratories and other facilities. And they may be, as you can see here, in Bethesda, which is where the main campus is, or elsewhere in Maryland. We have a huge cooperative campus up in Frederick, Maryland, Fort Detrick, so there's military component there as well. Baltimore has an intramural program for several key things. We also have, for those that are familiar, a major institute, National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences down at Research Triangle, and then we have labs and so forth in Montana, Massachusetts, and Detroit. Eligibility, I caution you, and this is true for the extramural as well, and this is where mentorship comes in and carefully reviewing, almost like a whiteboard, in terms of being strategic, in terms of extramural opportunities or intramural opportunities. Think through a couple steps so that you maximize the opportunities and minimize the problem of making yourself ineligible. So again, this is where, like for example, 5 years of relevant research. Sometimes it's a little bit more, sometimes it's actually never less. And then training can be done across the board in terms of various research areas. And there's the link in terms of follow-up for the intramural. Next slide, please. I mentioned about international. It's my understanding that there's a number of you that are come from international locations. I did check with my colleagues at the Fogarty International Center. This is actually one of the 27 institutes and centers at NIH. Virtually all the institutes and centers have international research and actually some career development, but Fogarty is like the lead for career development and policies and so forth. So I did check with my colleagues and they said I could use this slide with these links. Again, a note of caution, the coronavirus pandemic wreaked havoc, as we all know. So some of these programs have been sort of on hold, but I encourage you to go to the links, and then at the bottom is the general resource for Fogarty. But the first couple are for individual scientists from abroad who are interested in either staying in their own home country or spending time at NIH, particularly intramural, and then going back. And then the bottom several are US-based scientists who want to study abroad, like in Japan or Korea. And so again, this is a beginning effort. There's a lot of technicalities, as you might imagine, in terms of citizenship and eligibility. So again, this is just a start. Next slide, please. We also have, again, over the years, in terms of trying to help, we have a supplement program, and there's a continuity component. And this was actually the continuity component even before the pandemic. So if you go to our website, you'll see some of this. And we have like reentry supplements. There's certain requirements for that. It does have to be tied in with a parent award, as we say. So there has to be a more senior member who has an active grant, like an R01, but it also can be center grants as well. There's also the continuity supplements and also promoting diversity. So I again advise you to go through our website and the NIH websites. I do want to mention, for those that are a little more advanced, the K awards are the Career Development Awards. They're institutional, but also individual. Those are 5 years. They're absolutely wonderful. And at some point and they're under the extramural link. So you can look at that again in terms of strategizing more long-term. Next slide. Please, thank you. I do want to pay special attention to early stage investigators, which was sort of alluded to in terms of some of the earlier speakers. NIH carved this out because of the feeling that the vulnerability, but also the opportunities for early stage investigators. And here's our definition within the 10 years of your completed degree. And it's a little different for those that may be physicians in terms of residency and residency training and so forth. But again, these links you'll see help to define what is needed. But again, keep that in the back of your mind. If you're not quite ready, this is something that really can help you, because the early stage investigators give you sort of a priority status when you do go to put in your R01 grants. Next slide, please. And this next one is the one-stop shop, which I know is hard to read. I apologize for that, but the link is there. So there's policies and resources, but again, it's ESI, early stage investigators. There are ways to get extensions, and that was alluded to particularly by Julia. We have put these into policies. There's a committee that reviews these things, individual consideration given. There's some standard extensions that are given, but also extensions that are put forward in terms of requests. And so NIH is trying to be as responsive as we can and as supportive as we can for this very crucial early stage investigator pool. Next slide, please. I would be remiss, and I'm glad I put this in because Julia did cover it quite a bit. NIH has been for the last several years making efforts to redress harassment, and we're defining that broadly. There's a lot of emphasis, as you might imagine, on sexual harassment, and I have included a couple links here. And what I want to do, the first link is the most recent one, where there's the PAR is a program announcement, which just came out a month ago, that is looking at diversity, but also harassment, and it's looking for interventions, as I alluded to before. There's also very valuable, and this might be particularly important for the administrative leaders that are on the website today. The advisory committee to the director is a very high-level committee that advises our NIH director, Dr. Collins. And so you can see by the various bullets that there was a comprehensive report done in December 2019. Subsequent to that, there were announcements and policies, and June 10th is the date I want to bring to your attention here. I'm giving you the video cast link, and Dr. Lauer and Dr. Johnson have posted their actual slides on the ACD website, so you'll see it if you go through there. But I encourage you also to listen to their presentation, because you'll see their concern, their dedication. They are also responding to questions from the advisory committee to the director. People are taking this very seriously. Julia mentioned things about repercussions for senior level university officials and professors. You'll see a full report from Dr. Lauer on the extramural situation over the last couple of years. And there were firings. There have been penalties to the universities. Dr. Johnson looked at the intramural within NIH in terms of these kind of activities. So again, I encourage you. The other thing, the bottom button is NIH Guide for Grants and Contracts. That is our way to officially communicate with the public. The administrators on the session will know that, but the junior people, it's good for you. It comes out every Friday. There's things happening in terms of harassment, in terms of COVID and so forth, that it really would be good for you to be aware of. Next slide, please. Again, this is NIH last summer and fall undertook major surveys, and we got response rates. I think it was about a 37% response rate, 43,000 individual investigators. Excuse me. And at the bottom, you'll see the link. This was presented March 25th, also by Dr. Lauer, been a very busy man, and Dr. Marie Bernard, who had led the survey along with Dr. Hannah Valentine, who's since gone back to Stanford. So you'll see here that clearly it wreaked havoc, as we all know, but we were focusing on what to do in terms of the more junior level, the beginning researchers, and to try to, as much as we can, reduce the negative impacts. So I encourage you to look at that. There's about 10 slides. There's other resources. Next slide, please. And in closing, I sort of put this together. NIH is aware of the competition for junior investigators, postdocs, trying to get faculty positions and so forth. We're trying to encourage a broader career pathway, not just within academia, but hospitals, federal laboratories, biotech, pharmaceutical industry, be part of teams of researchers or individual investigators. So I encourage you to look at these two links that I provided here. And one sample that I've given you is research scientist, the Ph.D. pathway, which gives you some ideas for and how to maximize opportunities from NIH as you move forward. There's also a pathway for physician scientists, for vets, for pharmacists. So there's a variety of pathways there. And so I encourage you to do that. And the last slide is resources. Resources, again, the main NIH website, the NIH Guide, as we call it, but NIH Guide to Grants and Contracts. Those are important to plug into. The reporter is the way you can search funded research, and it also links into PubMed. It's a wonderful resource. First time I used it several years ago, I said, oh, this is wonderful, because you just go right into PubMed. And then if you find the ideal research project, it'll give you matches with similar research and so forth. The COVID website, this one is the extramural one. So for the public, it gives you public information, it gives you researcher information. Again, this is going to be ongoing, so we're just doing the best we can to support each other and to support particularly postdocs and young investigators. My email is there. Feel free to contact me. And then the research, our Office of Research on Women's Health is there. And we have a fair amount of information on that as well, in terms of career development, again, being one of the major elements of the reason for the office being created in 1990. And thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. Be happy to respond to questions in the open session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Begg, and to all of the panelists for those insightful discussions. And so in the last few minutes, I'll open it up for Q&A. I didn't see any questions pop in, but I did have a question for all the panelists that came to mind as you all were speaking about holding institutions and power structures accountable for progress in this space. We heard from Julia about establishing metrics, and we heard about institutional harassment policies, as well as some of the programmatic incentive structures available through funding. But what are you all's thoughts about thinking about historically and last few years, progress in this space that's been made, how can we hold institutions and power structures accountable for really making actionable progress in this space?
I think it's not always how we're measuring, but also what. So I would say there's a couple of things. First of all, we do spend a lot of time measuring diversity. So how many women appearing people do we have in our institutions? We don't always ask the right questions. So we often give the binary selection of gender. Right? So are you male, female, or don't want to say? And then also we like to look at numbers. So there's 50 women in our organization, but we don't necessarily look at the belonging statistics. We don't necessarily look at the inclusion statistics. We don't look at even the equity set, like how are people responding? How are they feeling? What is the retention rate, and why? As a social scientist, that is a big question that I always ask: is why? Why are people leaving? Where are they going? And what can be done about that? But we spend a lot more time looking at bringing people in, and also, what are the baseline metrics. So to me, it's what are we measuring, and are we measuring right things?
I would add to that the qualitative, not just the quantitative measure, but the qualitative data gathering. Exit interviews are critical for any institution, whether someone is leaving, in your view, voluntarily or involuntarily. That's when people are at their most honest and forthcoming. And those exit interviews should not just go into a file somewhere, but should be routinely reviewed, and for the identification of patterns of feedback. Everyone has their own unique and individual circumstances, but if you're seeing that you're being quite successful at recruiting underrepresented populations, but they're leaving at high rates, you have to investigate why that is. And also providing other avenues to get that qualitative feedback before you get to the exit interview stage is very helpful.
Caleb, it's Lise. Can I make a comment?
Yeah, I was about to call on you. Sure, go for it.
So I didn't include it in the slides because this is actually relatively new, but I think the audience will be very interested, and it's going to be expanded just on a rolling basis. So NIH feels very strongly that it cannot intervene and encourage and promote and enter dialogue with the extramural community unless it's looking at its own shop. So Dr. Collins and the other leaders at NIH have created an EDI office for equity, diversity, and inclusion. And if you go to the NIH.gov website, and then I think the easiest thing is to type in EDI or the full words, it will come up with a profile, a beginning profile of the NIH staff. And this is about 18,000 plus right now. Some of the data is as recent as March 31 of this year. Other data from last year, our fiscal year ends on September 30th. So it's looking at the scientific workforce, it's looking at the clinical workforce, and then other support. And it's looking at race and ethnicity, sometimes only race, but there's also ethnicity. So you can see, even within NIH, there are differences. And some of like myself, I've actually been at NIH over 20 years. I was surprised at some of this. And so the NIH staff are learning as well as others. So I encourage people to go into that and look at it. There's, and you have to hit some sublinks. It looks like there might only be two figures in the beginning, but if you hit some of the sublinks, it'll get up to about 10 figures and graphs. And so these are going to be regularly updated, but it's come about, again, because of NIH's awareness and concern about the structural racism and what we can do as a federal agency to either begin discussion or maybe do some modeling and sort of, look at our house as well. So I did want to mention that. The other thing, on the advisory committee to the director website, it's a relatively new program, about 3 months old, Unite, UNITE, which Dr. Marie Bernard is running, and it's looking at dealing with stakeholders, dealing with the racism, doing evaluation, and there's a whole group of slides in detail that are these are in the public domain, so they can be shared. And so I encourage people to look at that. And so I wanted to just mention additional resources at NIH, looking at our own staff or looking at ways that we can better address the disparities and inequities that are present in our society today. So thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you all so much for those comprehensive answers to that question. If I squeezed in one question, I wanted to make sure it was the accountability one. So I think that time has flown by pretty rapidly, so I'll go ahead and close us out with some logistical remarks. And I'll add some of these things to the chat as I'm mentioning them as well. And so if to the audience here, if you're not a member of the NPA yet, please join us. It's free if your institution is an NPA member, and you can check out nationalpostdoc.org/join. And I'll put email contact in the chat as well. And you should please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn as well. I've got some things there in the chat for you. There you go. We're on all the social media networks. And I also want to invite you to check out the agenda on our webpage. And in about 45 minutes, we'll be able to continue these conversations for panel 2 at 1 p.m. Eastern, 10 p.m. Pacific with yeah. And so the next thing that I want to do is to thank our partners throughout the full summit. We've got the Association for Women in Science, the Association of American Medical Colleges, the Higher Education Recruitment Consortium, the National Postdoc Association, and Out to Innovate. And I want to give a huge thank you to our 3 speakers today. You all were great. And thank you to everyone for tuning in and for your interest in promoting gender equity. And I look forward to seeing you all throughout the rest of the summit. So have a great day and tune in for the rest of the sessions. Thank you.
Thank you.